Eric Kuhne is the founding principal of Eric Kuhne and Associates in London, but he's an American, and his presentation to the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, the subject matter is going to blow your mind because one of the questions we answer here is if you could design a city from scratch and you had a place to plunk it down and you could build whatever you want, what would you do and what would it look like in different cultures? And some of the things that are being planned today are just incredible. The title of your presentation is Starcatchers versus Skyscrapers, and building skylines of the future, and I wonder what your definition of a starcatcher and a skyscraper is.
Well, the term skyscraper came from the clipper ships that used to bring tea from the Orient back to the United Kingdom and, of course, over to America. And they literally talked about the sky being scraped by the masts of the ship. And it was adopted then by Louis Sullivan and Company here in Chicago as the name for the new towers as a building type that emerged. But we think that now when we're talking about towers that are 2.5, 3 times as tall as the Empire State Building in a new century, we need a new term. And so starcatchers comes from that term. Now, I have to confess that my father was a master navigator in the Air Force, and we used to go out at night and look at the constellations, and it was all about catching the stars and weaving the stories through the great collection of dots in the sky. But for us, I think that you do need a term to describe these incredibly tall buildings. The Mubarak Al-Kabir Tower that we designed for the Emir of Kuwait is 1,001 meters in height. And when you're over 1 kilometer tall, there's a whole different idea that goes on, because they're literally like vertical villages stacked on top of each other. And there's a whole new ethos and conscientiousness that's needed to make these things sustainable, not about technology or energy, but as communities. And they are stacked communities. They're just vertical subways, or what the elevators are, as opposed to horizontal subways. But the quality of the community life in these towers is the essential breakpoint on whether they will ever succeed as building types. And so all of our research has been done to make these exemplary communities, so that the sky gardens that are used to be talked about in skyscrapers, we now call star gardens. They are literally town squares. And so our Tower of 1,001 Arabian Nights, which gets its height, by the way, from 1,001 Arabian Nights, the stories, that 1,001 meters is 7 30-story towers stacked on top of each other, 7 villages stacked on top of each other, with town squares, schools, entertainment, retail, maintenance, medical facilities, and all of the emergency services in between each of those villages stacked up. So you're never more than an elevator ride away from a functioning corner store in a town square. And that is what I think will redefine the towers for our time. And we call those, of course, starcatchers.
You have 2 principal projects that we're just going to address here briefly before getting into the larger issue of what this is. And what I find interesting about it is that as a media person, I've been following tall buildings and their evolution in the 1990s and the 2000s to where when we started doing that in about 1997 and people mentioned a 2,000-foot tall building, we were all just agog, imagining a building that much taller than the Sears Tower right here in Chicago. However, as time goes on, all of those wild, seemingly wild ideas we heard about mega cities and 13,000-foot tall buildings and that kind of thing are being seriously talked about, number one, and dirt's being moved and holes are being drilled today. So this is indeed in the realm of reality. And before we go into this, I'm going to ask you, it's one thing to plan it on a drawing board. How feasible is this, and is this actually going to happen, do you think?
Well, these are impossible economic times, and we are talking about improbable projects. I don't want to make anybody believe that this is an easy effort, but the very fact that they're right at the edge of what we can do is where the interest is. We know that on the tower that we're working on, for instance, that we are right at the edge of what the structure can actually support at 1,001 meters high. That's and literally right at the edge. Concrete has to go through a magic alchemy in order to support itself up to a certain height, and then the steel has to be even more provocative in the way it's produced to get that extra distance to hit that 1001 meter mark. Mechanical systems are the same way. But the real issue is that things like wind and temperature control, I mean, there's 100 degrees Fahrenheit temperature difference from the top of our towers to the base. That's ridiculous. The towers expand and contract feet, not inches. And so you have a whole new consciousness about the mechanics of materials and structure and mechanical systems. But what I'm interested in is in the poetry of these things and the beauty of them as much as the physicality of them. Because when you do a silhouette on a skyline, it better capture the heart of the people that have to look at it. And sure, we can build mechanistic towers that are so thoughtfully done given the technology of the time, but the technology is out of date by the time you get it done. But the thing that endures is the shape and the beauty and whether it touches the hearts and souls of the people that look at it. So our tower of 1001 Arabian Nights has 3 blades like a propeller, and each blade rises and stops short of the next one going up. And on top of each one, we have a place of worship, a synagogue, a cathedral, a mosque, and the centerpiece that goes up has at its top an interdenominational chapel. And so the Emir of Kuwait comes and he says, Eric, how am I going to do this? And I said, it's so easy. It's so simple. Here, I got the words for you. Okay? We can no longer depend upon Europe and North America to solve the conflict of the faiths. We, and we alone, as Kuwaitis, sitting at the cradle of the Abrahamic faiths, at the crossroads of the Silk Routes, have a chance to teach the world that the monotheistic faiths have more in common than they have that separates us. And in doing so, we will restore the roots of our faith at the place where they were born and teach the world that religion and faith unites us rather than divides us.
We were just having a discussion this morning about the desire to build something versus the economic reality of building something. And I know you've heard this plenty of times, but often there's a view of what we can do that's way up here, we're aiming way up here, and the economics of what we can do and the imagination of what we can do is sometimes down here just constrained by reality. But I made the remark that eventually this comes up to this level.
Absolutely. Remember, Rockefeller Center and the Empire State Building were built during the height of the Depression. And those buildings continue to sustain themselves as viable bits of economic real estate as much as anything else. It's amazing that they turned out as beautiful as they did, given all those economic constraints that were nipping at their heels as well. What we have found is when you create an icon, it redefines its own economic market. And the margins that you describe with an iconic building that touches people in their heart or their beliefs creates its own market and will close that gap almost every single time. But that you have to be conscientious about that. You can't be glib. You have to respect the laws of nature and physics in terms of materials. But if you get it right, the market will move up to where you are. You don't have to drop down to where the market is. The market always is reinventing itself. People are getting wealthier every year in the world. And the world is better off, but only if you honor its desire to improve itself. And that is a constant around the world.
Some of the terminology that you use here, really getting away from the fact that there's a super tall here, that's one component of this larger city. And first I should ask you about that. What are all of the features of this city that you're planning besides this mega tower?
Well, the city of Silk, Madinat al-Harir in Arabic, there are 30 communities, each with about 25,000 people each. And they're all based on the molecule of the family, which the one thing about Islamic life is that the family is sacred. And so once we figured out that the family molecule was how societies were built, we knew how many families needed to go with the day mosque and a market and a school and grocery stores and all of that within walking distance. Once we set that up, They then became the neighborhoods create the villages then become these communities of roughly 25,000 people. Now that's a standard city in Arabian history. So once we got those in place, then we knew that we had the pattern of life that these folks lived folded in and restored, as opposed to trying to get them into American suburbs or grids from Roman or Etruscan encampments and all that other nonsense from Europe. And then we stitched all those together with ribbons of parks and gardens and lakes. And then these city centers that we put, there are 4 city centers, a city of commerce, city of culture, city of leisure, and eco-city. And each of those represents the new economies that the Emir's Minister for Economic Development outlined. So they expect explosive growth in those 4 areas. What's interesting is that the eco-city sits in the middle of a 50 square mile wildlife sanctuary that is for all the migratory birds flying up from Africa into Central Asia every year. And setting aside that sanctuary at the center of this city is unbelievable gesture. And he saw that that is an opportunity to create a college or university of research to study the flora and the fauna of the reforestation of the deserts and creating the revegetation of the deserts as a fundamental economy that he could then export to the arid regions of the world. So we worked with them to develop these 4 city centers, and then connecting to these 4 city centers are these 30 communities. And that's literally how it all came out. But there had to be the vision there about what is the new economy for Kuwait? How do we spread that economy through the Middle East? How do we connect primary infrastructure up as far as up to Kazakhstan to tap into the natural resources? And how do we help the Middle East go from a politics of fear and war to an economy of wealth and jobs?
2 questions come out of that. Number 1 is that I've long lamented the way American cities are constructed. They just kind of seem to ratchet up the stress level. And I don't know if it's a European or a Roman, as you say, thing, which is an interesting comment, but the impetus here is to be more centralized, I guess, is the characteristic, where in a culture that is not a Western culture, is decentralization part of it?
You are absolutely spot right on. And I will tell you, the biggest conceit of the 20th century is asking people to move to products and services as opposed to moving products and services to where people live. And every time you see a big tin box shed, and I don't care, you can put the names on it yourself, they destroy the communities that they serve. And if you make those tin sheds warehouses as opposed to shopping areas and bring the corner stores back into the communities so that it's comfortable enough the kids can run down to the end of the street to get a loaf of bread or a bouquet of flowers or a newspaper for the afternoon, you change the health and dynamics of those communities forever. And we know from our research we did with the National Health Service in the United Kingdom that whenever people can walk to get fresh food, the 30 preventable diseases, the incidence of the 30 preventable diseases is cut by nearly 50%. Life expectancy goes up by 7 years. Kids' test scores in school go up. Crime almost evaporates. Mental health problems go away because people are walking on the street, talking to each other, as opposed to getting into these cars, which seals them up from the rest of the world. And the mayor of Amsterdam had a wonderful phrase for it. He said, the great thing about towns in Holland is the accidental encounter. That you can have a stressful fight with your boss or your friend or your partner. You know, you go out for a walk and somebody you bump into and just smiles at you, and it will drain away the rage and anxiety that you have in an instant. You get in a car and the car accelerates those feelings of anguish. And I believe in cars as much as the next person. I mean, we plan for cars, we integrate cars in all of our projects, but all it is if you bring 85% of what's required to sustain a family over the course of a week within walking distance, the quality of life of that community will just go off the charts. And America has forgotten the genius of the small town.
And you lamented the fact that these Middle Eastern cultures are kind of forgetting the genius of their own.
Yeah, they've forsaken their own culture to import European and American designs. I mean, just because you put on a pinstripe suit and get into the country club doesn't mean anyone's going to respect you. It's all about trying to get to the ethos of that culture, of what makes it tick. And it's what is that molecule? What is that fundamental social unit? And in the Middle East, it's definitely the family, where they have on the average of 4 and 5 kids per family as opposed to 1.5 to 2 here in America. But even in the UK and the United States, even when you find communities that people, if you were to ask or do an interview of what people thought the greatest places to live were, I'm almost willing to bet that 90% of them would say places where they can end up walking to get a loaf of bread or a slab of beef for dinner, or their haircut, or card shop or newsagents and whatnot.
Just the other day, my wife and I were driving through the country. We live in a medium-sized city in Missouri, and we're driving in a rural area and came across a little town that had been long ago run down and forgotten, and just was not a real nice place. And more or less, my exact words to her were, "Gee, wouldn't it be nice if these little towns were revived and life just revolved on this axis, more on the other one."
Absolutely.
And she said, and her exact words to me is, "That sounds like a science fiction story," which kind of is the imagery that what you're saying is conjured up. The second question I wanted to ask you was the Kuwait economy. Of course, everything over there is largely based on oil, and we're talking, I guess, about a fundamental change from an oil-based economy to an intellectual, knowledge economy?
Absolutely. There's a great phrase that's used in the Arabian Gulf, and it's getting away from natural resources to human resources. Kuwait's an unusual example because it was the only country that was devastated by war around the Arabian Gulf. The invasion of 1990 chased all the entrepreneurial class out. So there they have an unusual problem of trying to recreate the entrepreneurial class of people. In the rest of the Gulf Coast countries in the Middle East, they have a problem as you described, which is that they rely more on natural resources than the human resources to produce the wealth of the nation. And Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, had a wonderful discussion about this. He talked about that in America, it was no taxation without representation, in a beautiful little poetic metaphor, okay? Which is that if you're going to take my money from my earnings, then I want to say about where you spend the money. Pretty simple, okay? What we're finding in developing countries is the reverse. There's no representation without taxation. In other words, if your citizenry is not producing the wealth of the nation, you're not going to tax them, and you're not going to listen to them. And so the biggest problem that these resource-rich countries have, and by the way, I would include Norway in that as well with the North Sea oil, is that they ignore their citizens because they're making all their money out of the ground. And everywhere I go, I tell them that I'm delighted you have oil money. I'm thrilled, you're going to jack everybody else up and make a fortune on that, but you're going to destroy your culture. Until you stop investing in the entrepreneurial spirit of your people, you will simply run out of oil and you will run out of life. And the conversations that alone generates are monumental discussions.
I was about to start one right there, because we are constantly being lectured in this country about sprawl. And I don't know about you, I love Chicago, it's my hometown, I'll always be from here, but I live 500 miles from here, and I live there for a reason. And when I think about what it would take to extend services, extend serviceable infrastructure that would serve a smaller community, and the kind of economic concentrations that you need to have just to generate business and to manufacture goods, and then I think about what you said about decentralization. Are there inherent problems in decentralization? Is there a conflict there between the two that can only be resolved by?
No, first of all, growing up as an American on Air Force bases, my dad was a master navigator, flew B-52s, but Air Force bases function like little towns, although that being the time when I was growing up, they were pretty much segregated little towns. The thing is, is that the suburbs that are being built in America today are much more savvy about bringing prime amenities, food, recreation, entertainment, education into those suburbs. Because everybody's seen 50 years of suburban construction and creating ghost towns, basically. And so America moves faster than any other country in the world in terms of reinventing itself. And the whole world looks to America because of that. The freedoms and liberties that we take for granted, the rest of the world barely knows. And it's not democracy that we have to shove down everyone's throats around the world. All we have to do is teach them about the genius of liberty and freedoms. And they'll figure out how to do that.
Well, and allow them to do it within their own context.
Exactly right. Absolutely. And the same thing is true with the cities, is that all we have to talk about is the quality of life of the citizens and then work within their own legacy of their own civilizations and come up with new forms as opposed to adopting American or European city forms into Asia, India, and the Middle East. I mean, those three chunks of the world are the big growth parts of the world. Okay, a billion people in India that'll soon pass China, 1.3 billion people in China, and the Middle East, which is roughly 450 million people, and among the 30 nations that make up the Middle East. And all those countries are developing nations, and they all need to honor the roots and the heritage of their own civilization as opposed to trying to be Western. And if they do that, they'll be teaching the rest of the world some pretty great stuff.
Well, and what really strikes me about this is that the things that you are saying, I have heard from all sides of the political spectrum in this country alone, because some of the things that you've said, I've heard from conservative writers.
Yeah.
Some of the things you've said I've heard from liberal writers, and I think it's this desire for community again, and the desire for decentralization and to get small.
Well, I think also one of the other things that's happened is America forgot that it won the war, and with that comes a humility and grace of leadership as opposed to an aggressive bully. And we've lived under a politics of fear and an economic system of greed that has finally collapsed. And we need a new civic sensibility that deals with the gracefulness of people's lives as opposed to just fueling ambition and achievement. And I think when people believe in the American dream all over the world, they may not believe in America and they may not believe in Americans, but the American dream is a spirit of opportunity where any individual can redefine a place in the world for themselves and their family. And that everybody wants. What we need to do as Americans is help the rest of the world find that dream within the context of their own cultures.
I want to ask you briefly about the other project, the House of Wisdom, the Mohammed bin Rashid Garden in Dubai, which again goes to your theme of architecture as the new diplomacy. And one of the centerpieces on there is a university campus, plus the Nakheel Tower, which they're actually moving dirt for now.
I know. Well, the Mohammed bin Rashid Gardens was done for Sheikh Mohammed. He was concerned that the routine parts of everyday life in Dubai were not being met, that the speculation on the towers, which have transformed Dubai for the world, the skyline of Dubai for the world has been transformed by those towers, weren't serving the people that live there. So if you're rich, an expat, staying at a luxury resort or a member of the royal family, life was wonderful. If you were in the service industry servicing all those folks, it was a pretty dreadful, well, as they say, less than salubrious existence. So what we said was, okay, let's see if we can create a community that creates something that's not available in Dubai, which is houses that have backyards. Okay, something where the food is within walking distance from where you live. Okay?
Because the development that's there right now doesn't look that way.
It doesn't, no. And so Mohammed bin Rashid Gardens did three big moves, and its strength is in these three moves. Instead of pouring sand into the Gulf in the shape of palm trees, we dig a canal into the desert and bring the Gulf water into the desert. And it's like a calligraphy in the desert, the way the canal comes through, which actually is in the shape of the Milky Way, but so I'll get to that in a bit. So we bring water into the desert. It becomes democratically accessible waterfronts because no waterfronts in Dubai are available for the public to get to. They're all controlled by the hotels, the royal family, or the super rich. So we create the equivalent of 50 miles of waterfront in the desert. Then we build the largest park and garden system that has ever been conceived in the Middle East. And again, the gardens are irrigated by sweet water, desalination water, gray water that's been purified, and salt water. We have saltwater irrigated gardens we're going to be building. So this huge garden complex, which again, only the wealthy could afford or the royalty could afford in the past, is now open to the public. And then we build homes that have backyards. And then we put in the 4 city centers, which are the House of Commerce, the House of Nature, the House of Humanity, and the House of Wisdom. Now, the great thing about the House of Wisdom is that it's actually based on the House of Wisdom that was outside Baghdad in the 10th century. It was called the Bat al-Hikmah. And this eccentric caliph, who is obsessed with knowledge, hired scholars from Morocco to China and Russia to the middle of Africa to come and learn and work together. And they translated everything they could into 7 different languages. So he gets notice that the Sultan in Constantinople, then now Istanbul, had all these old manuscripts that he was going to torch. So he brings his scholars to Constantinople, meets with the Sultan, and says, look, before you destroy these, why don't you let my guys translate these? And in doing so, they translate all the Greek histories, all the Greek dramas, all the Greek philosophers' work, and the early Romans' work, and translate into 7 languages distributed throughout the known world, from China to Spain, Central Asia to the middle of Africa. And all that is done over a period of 250 to 300 years and begins the Renaissance in Europe when it's discovered by the Jesuits. These are profound points in history where individuals change the world. And that scholarship, I said to Sheikh Mohammed, you must do for your country in your time today. We must build a new House of Wisdom that takes the best writings of the scholars of the world, translate it into Arabic, and spread it around the Middle East so that your people, all the people of the Middle East, have access to the great thoughts of the world. And in doing so, then you will also translate your culture's history for the rest of the world to understand and move then up on parity with the other great civilizations on the planet. And you can imagine the reaction. I mean, you know, he has so many Americans and Europeans parading through his country. All the leaders of the Middle East do. And all they're doing basically is carpetbaggers brokering their fares from their home countries. Our base of departure is to honor the ethos and the spirit of the civilization from which that country emerged. And in doing so, you can't help but do something iconic and new, because it will speak to the heart and soul of the very people that you're designing for. And so the architecture is a new diplomacy because it celebrates the genius of the culture that you want to engage, not the genius of the culture you come from.
It's pretty easy to sell people their own dreams, isn't it?
Absolutely. And they are great dreams, too. I mean,
I must ask you, because
yeah.
you're talking like part historian, part holy man, part developer, and this is truly a totally different concept of living, of everyday living. And I mean, as I said earlier, a lot of this does sound science fiction. What is your background?
I trained in art and architecture. My mother was a teacher. The library was always in the dining room. You know, we grew up, and when we had dinner, Mom or Dad would reach over their shoulder and say, well, who's going to join us for dinner tonight? And we'd all squeal as kids. But the great thoughts written in those books would end up replacing the plates on the table. And books were windows to the world for us. And we grew up knowing that the world's diversity was its strength, not its weakness. And that the most important thing we could ever do whenever we traveled or did anything in our lives is honor the people whom we visited. And that's just became the way architecture just became the way that I expressed that when I grew up.
How does all of this square with just the hard economics of what you're doing? And in Kuwait, maybe the rules are different because they have a lot of oil wealth and they can certainly afford to do some of these things. And part of the problem may always have been that the resources that belong to the people have not always reached them. So are these cities being, in theory, being built with the country's natural resources going back to the people finally getting there?
They are, and that question that you've asked about the economics is the most important thing to understand on the practical side of this. You use the resources you have at the moment, but if you use them creatively, you can change the way the society exists. And Rockefeller Center was built really to assuage the guilt of the father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., for bankrupting all the small wildcatting oil men in the United States. So I don't worry too much about what produces the infrastructure to create a new city, because I think that you have to grab what you have available. And economics is not a constant. It is a cultural phenomenon, not a mathematic phenomenon, and it changes with every generation what the economic mix is. So we'll tap into whatever resources we can to do this. But the result of what we produce will change the economy of that place forever. And the best part about our work is that every investor that we've worked with has produced a far greater return by respecting the diversity of the people that are going to experience their project than by trying to homogenize it in just another cookie cutter solution from North America or Europe.
The Nikhil Tower, again, for which dirt is being moved and holes being drilled, what's the approximate height figure on this building?
I think it's actually taller than ours. And
is a centerpiece of this particular place, is it not?
Not of ours.
Okay.
No. Nikhil is another project that's being developed by Woods Bagot, and Nikhil is one of the three big development companies.
Okay, I'm sorry, my error. The centerpiece of this was the university, was it not?
That's right. That's right. The House of Wisdom. That's right.
Okay, I'm getting my projects confused,
okay.
But these are all such amazing future visions that
no, it's easy to do too.
It's easy to do. We're talking, and I'll go ahead and sum it up because we could talk about this for hours, but we are talking about lifestyle changes and life changes and building cities from scratch, that the wealth, I guess, is there. What stage are these at? Are these serious proposals, or are these going to be done?
They're all in what we're calling enabling works. So canals being dug, the power lines that crisscross these sites are being taken down and buried.
So they can slowly evolve without having...
They all have to evolve. Anybody says a city like this is going to be built in 10 years is silly.
So this is a master plan we're talking
about. For
about.
about 20 to 25 years for both City of Silk and Mohammed bin Rashid Gardens. But the important thing about it is that the debates that are happening in the parliament in Kuwait and the conversations that are happening with the ministers in the United Arab Emirates are today now some of the most enlightened debates that are going on anywhere in the world about cities. And so they are constantly evolving. What impresses me is that the forms of these cities that we've laid out is holding as it evolves. And like Lafont's plan for Washington, D.C., the philosophy of building a city for 200 years later was put in place when he laid that out for Jefferson and Washington. And the armature of those streets and the network of that, arguably today, is one of the finest capital cities in the world. And what I said to Sheikh Mohammed and the Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabal, is let's design a city that will be a capital city in spirit, if not in fact. And to do that, we need to get parks and gardens and boulevards and considerations of public buildings and universities and medical facilities and an ecological sensibility for our time.
And a realistic time frame is over the next 50 years, the next...
That's right. Well, probably given the growth, Kuwait in particular, which has just a terrible burden of so many immigrants, they have to build these things fast, which is very similar to the cities in China that you mentioned, as well as India. And Dubai has slowed a bit on its growth, but very similar circumstances. Mohammed bin Rashid Gardens is the only hope for a city the way you and I know a city, which is a place where you can take your kids to a park, walk along the waterfront with your spouse, sit and have a cafe overlooking a spectacular skyline. That's not available to the citizens of Dubai yet. And that's what we want to produce. And I think that, with today, you have an international consciousness about living, about civic life that we've never had before. People travel the world, they see these cities, and they go, why can't we have this at home? And that is a voice that cannot be squelched. And so the more these cities move to giving voice to their citizens, the more they will have to respond to demands that the quality of the routine life is going to improve.
Well, I want to thank you for this conversation, and I think that there are, again, this could go on for hours because there's so many questions that come up, but in the last however long it's been, we've reconciled the three major religions and really have changed the face of life, but of lifestyles, but I think that there are a lot of things in here that most anybody will resonate with most anyone.
Well, it's been a real joy talking about this, and I love my art, and I love the fact that we're, we haven't grown up yet. We still think we can change the world.
Right. Eric Kuhne is a founding principal with Eric Kuhne and Associates in London at the 2009 Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat